Richard, let me just get your initial reaction to what we saw. I think a lot of people, Ambassador McFaul, who was the U.S. ambassador to Russia, said he went over the course of the day from outrage to sadness that a United States president would stand next to a tyrant who's been proven to be interfering in our democratic process and not standing up to him and giving him the higher ground.
Particularly, Willie, when you not just look at yesterday, but you take a step back and look at the preceding week. This was a week in which self-interest took precedence over the national interest, in which America first gave way to Russia first. And this is a president who basically was unwilling to take on Russia, but was more than willing to take on NATO, the EU, and the UK. The so-called special relationship was essentially discarded. So the contrast between the kid gloves with which he dealt with Mr. Putin and the frontal assaults on our closest allies, who for 70 years have been an integral part of America's relationship with the world, that contrast was in stark relief yesterday. It was a bad week for the United States and for American foreign policy. Yesterday capped it off.
And Caddy K, we heard across Europe yesterday discouraging words from American allies that stood with us through a generational Cold War with the Soviet Union, who was constantly being pushed to do more by American presidents to push back against Russia. Yesterday, in Britain, in Germany, across the continent, we had one leader after another say we can no longer trust the United States of America.
Yeah, it was the German foreign minister was one of the first to come out and say this means we can't trust the White House anymore after that press conference. Remember, those European allies are right up against Russia's borders, some of them as well, so they feel this very intensely. They know what Russian meddling looks like. Some of those countries have experienced it firsthand, what it's like to have Russian troops on their soil and to be occupied by the Soviet Union. No one's thinking we're going back to that, Joe, but everybody in Europe is looking at, well, what do we do now? How do we protect ourselves if the United States is going to withdraw this completely, and not just withdraw, but if the US is now going to side with the power that we have long seen as our enemy and who has re-emerged as an aggressive actor on the world stage just in the last few years. The timing of Donald Trump reaching out to Russia like this, opening the door for Russia to walk back in from the cold and reassume a place on the world stage like this with no positive implications. And I think it's worth looking forward after this summit. There was not a single thing that was said during the course of that press conference that would lead us to believe that Russian behavior is now going to improve. Not a single thing. Not in Ukraine, not in Syria, not in election meddling, not in the Baltics. If you could come out of that press conference and say, well, yes, maybe that 2-hour-long meeting behind closed doors had led to a better relationship, and now President Trump could influence Putin to act better on the world stage, that would be one thing. But nothing was said that would make us think that was the case.
Well, you just looked at the visuals yesterday, and even if you weren't listening to the sound, even if you look at the pictures, Donald Trump looked like a scared child. He was kowtowing to Vladimir Putin, who was in complete control of the press conference. And it was not only disappointing as an American to see a U.S. president and what he said, it was disappointing to see an American president look as weak as Donald Trump looked, as fearful as Donald Trump looked, as out of control as Donald Trump looked, as owned as Donald Trump looked. Vladimir Putin owned, look at that picture, Vladimir Putin owns Donald Trump. And both of the men know it. And David Ignatius, I cannot imagine what it's like being Dan Coates this morning, or being somebody in America's intel agencies that have delivered the goods to the commander-in-chief, have proven that the attacks took place and where the attacks came from and how they were launched, and in fact, who specifically launched them and from what buildings halfway across the world they've been launched in. This should be a moment in America's intel community for celebration. They got a chance to prove that they are the best and the brightest on the planet. Instead, they have a president who yesterday defended Vladimir Putin and his spy agencies against forensic evidence that cannot be denied. How do they go to work this morning? What do they do? What is their attitude?
Joe, I think this was a tipping point. I wrote yesterday you could almost hear the fabric of Trump's presidency ripping after he said those words. I made a point of talking to a number of former intelligence officers after he made those comments, and to be honest, they were shocked. Mike Hayden, who ran the agency, said he was stunned to hear the words. He imagined all of the one-word expletives up and down the corridors at the agency, at the NSA, as people watched their screens and saw what had happened, that the president had sided with our adversary against their intelligence. Will Hurd, who's a Republican congressman from Texas, a very courageous operations officer, said he was stunned that an American president would let himself get played by a Russian president that way. Dan Hoffman, who was our station chief in Moscow, said Trump's behavior was like asking a criminal to solve a crime. That's just a sampling of the responses from the intelligence people who've been on the front lines as they watched their president do this. The reaction from Republicans we'll talk about, but I felt that we were beginning to hear from people who've refrained from criticism. One obvious example is Newt Gingrich. Newt Gingrich said, "This is the worst mistake of your presidency. You need to do something quickly about it." And that's just one sign that Donald Trump went into a space with the whole world watching that was different yesterday, and we all saw it, and I think the world's reacting to it now.
So, Mike, it's obviously we're outraged by what we saw yesterday, but Joe used another word, which was disappointing, and this is not a political statement. This is a statement as an American. It's disappointing to watch your president stand up there next to an obvious foe, someone who has tried to change our country by invading the democratic process. It's disappointing. It's sad to watch a president not stand up and, in most basic terms, stick up for your country on the world stage, standing next to that guy, to not stick up for his own country.
Willie, you know, to use a phrase, yesterday really was a day to cry for the country. This great republic that means so much to so many around the world. To see the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, shrink next to Vladimir Putin, to drop his oath of office, to drop his duty on a world stage to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, and then to have so many here in this country on TV programs like this one say, "What a surprise." No, this was not a surprise. This was Mr. Trump in full view of the world. This is who he is: ignorant, narcissistic, all involved with himself. His priority is himself, not the country, not the presidency. He is unaware of history. He was unaware, certainly yesterday, of anything that this republic has stood for through the ages. The only thing he was aware of, clearly, was that he was in Putin's pocket.
I don't know if ignorant is so much the word as scared. You look at the visuals, you listen to every interview Donald Trump has ever given, and he is clearly scared of Vladimir Putin. He is clearly afraid to ever cross the Russian leader. He is clearly in his pocket. Who else? And we talked about our interview with Donald Trump in December of 2015. Soon after, I think during the Super Bowl, he was, or maybe it was in 2017 for the Super Bowl, but I remember he got interviewed by Bill O'Reilly and said the same thing, that Vladimir Putin was a strong leader. And when O'Reilly brought up the fact that Putin killed people, Donald Trump said, yeah, well, our soldiers killed people in Iraq as well. So Donald Trump is showing a moral equivalency between the men and women in uniform and a dictator that's invaded 2 countries in a decade, shot down a passenger airliner, poisoned and killed a mother in England, and has committed one atrocity after another atrocity over the past decade. And yet Donald Trump continues to play straight out of Vladimir Putin's pocket. Dan Baltz in the Washington Post wrote this morning that the president refused to stand for the country he was elected to represent and protect. Time and time again, that certainly was obvious for Republicans and Democrats alike, for Trump supporters and Trump antagonists yesterday, who saw Vladimir Putin own the American president. Heidi, we did hear some criticism from Republicans on Capitol Hill. But the question is, what is next? Do they continue criticizing him? What about the Republicans who seem to be doing Vladimir Putin's bidding, who are desperate to stop Robert Mueller and the Justice Department's investigation, which is uncovering which Russian spies, which Russian agents, which Russian agencies are still trying to subvert American democracy? Does yesterday's shameful performance change any dynamics on Capitol Hill?
John Brennan, I think, had the most compelling question for these same members of Congress when he said, "Republican patriots, where are you?" And it was within the following hours that we got some answers, Joe. And I will just say at the top, though, what we got was varying degrees of words.
Heidi, we've lost your mic. We're going to come back to you in 1 second. We've got a little problem to work out there. Joe, I think something that we can all consider now, having watched the president in full view out in public in that press conference, cower next to President Putin, is why did he want to be alone in that room for 2 hours with Vladimir Putin? Why didn't he want Dan Coates or Mike Pompeo or someone like that in that room? What did he need to say to Vladimir Putin in private that he didn't want anyone else to hear? I think that's a new and interesting question, given the way we saw he behaved out in public with Vladimir Putin yesterday.
Well, and Willie, the follow-up question is, what did Vladimir Putin want to say to Donald Trump?
Right.
What message did he want to deliver? What order did he want to give? What instruction did he want to give to Donald Trump? This is John Meacham, yet another time where Donald Trump was absolutely insistent that these two gentlemen be alone. There has been some question for some time. It's just for reasonable, rational Americans, it's no longer a question. Right. Donald Trump, for some reason, is owned by Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin has him in his pocket, as Mike Barnacle said. The question is, what's the payoff? What, as you said, what Vladimir Putin has, when a KGB agent owns somebody through compromising information, the payoff is not a cheery press conference where you make the American president look like a bumbling, weak, fat fool.
Right.
The payoff is something, unfortunately, always far graver.
Well, there are a couple of thoughts here. One is, if for some reason Putin, in his neo-czarist, neo-Soviet way, wants to, say, take the Baltic states back, which they lost in 1991, at that point, after given, again, not just yesterday, but go back 4 or 5 days, given the way the president talked about NATO, does the president refuse to project power under Article 5, thereby shattering the Western alliance, not just because of what he talked about or he's talking to Erdogan on the photo op, but we're talking about a serious question of actual failure to live up to our treaty obligations. That is a hyperbolic point to make. I didn't think in all of the madness since in the last 3 years or so, since the escalator, that I would be saying that, because I always thought, for a long time I have thought, that we were hyperventilating a bit about the Russia connection. I now don't think so. And the only thing, and the other seemingly hyperbolic, but now totally data-driven point I would make, is that when John Brennan made that statement yesterday about it meets the definition of high crimes and misdemeanors, with all respect, I would say actually the definition it meets is the first word of the impeachment article in the Constitution, which is treason, bribery, and high crimes and misdemeanors. Has the President of the United States now, in a sufficient way, shown that he is giving aid and comfort to an enemy? And that's the question that the Congress of the United States, without looking at their polls, without getting their briefings about what their base thinks, they actually have to, at this point, live up to an oath that they took.
Yeah, they certainly do. And Willie, you know, if you look at what Donald Trump has said over the past week, it's not just that he has given Vladimir Putin everything Vladimir Putin has wanted. He has undermined America's closest alliances. He called, when asked who America's greatest foe was, he said the European Union first.
Yep.
He went to Britain. He attacked Theresa May. He constantly attacks Angela Merkel. This is a guy who, again, it's been a two-step process. It's not just been kowtowing and being a blubbering idiot in front of Vladimir Putin on the world stage. He completely undermined America's democratic allies who we have been working with for the past 50 years to keep Russia in Russia.
And by the way, has been since he became president, going after our allies in a way he never goes after Vladimir Putin. I want to go back to Heidi Prisbilla. We got her mic working. We're talking about Republican reaction to all this. Almost to a man and a woman, Republicans on Capitol Hill came out against the president's performance yesterday, and in almost every corner of Fox News, I should point out, too, with some notable exceptions that we'll play coming up in just a bit, including an interview with the president and Sean Hannity. What do Republicans do now, though? Angry, sad tweets are nice on day one, but is there something they're willing to do to intervene here?
Right. It was John Brennan, Willie, who said, Republican patriots, where are you? And within the ensuing hours, we saw that there were a lot of Republicans who were willing to speak out in various degrees. But in the end, it was all words, a lot of words. We didn't hear from Republicans about a lot of actions. For instance, I would group one category as the leadership, with Kevin McCarthy, Senator McConnell, Senator Cornyn coming out in strong defense of U.S. intelligence agencies, but stopping short of actually condemning the president. Then you saw another group, much more forceful, led by John McCain, for instance, who called this display actually disgraceful. And you saw a number of members who weren't just the usual retiring variety of Republicans, including Lisa Murkowski, who also used similar language. However, what I did not hear was a lot of Republicans proposing specific action.
Right.
Actually, I think one of the only ones was Senator Toomey, who said unless Vladimir Putin is prepared to extradite these 12 Russians, we should consider additional sanctions. And just to be clear, there is in fact a lot of things that this Republican Congress could do, starting with bringing in the president's national security team to sit for hearings to answer what exactly happened on the sidelines. None of them actually know. None of us know what happened in the one-to-one, except that nice-looking lady with the notepad who was the translator. But they may be able to provide some more clues as to what was the president's state of mind before, what was the debriefing after. And we're not hearing from many Republicans about their intentions to do that. There is right now a movement in the House to try and water down some of these sanctions. Is that going to stop? Is the display, for example, that we saw in the House in that House hearing with Trey Gowdy bashing the FBI, bashing the Justice Department, going to stop? We don't have any specific vows to take any action like that yet. They're just coming back today to Capitol Hill,
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens.
Well, we'll see. I would be shocked if anybody shocked. I was shocked by the president's performance yesterday, but shocked if any Republican at this stage is going to use their position to try to gain a little favor with Donald Trump, a man who obviously is owned by Vladimir Putin, whether they're really now going to be bashing the director of the FBI and the Justice Department and Robert Mueller over an investigation that is proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that Russia did try to impact the election. And one thing we haven't noted yet, Willie, about, and I think great ideas by Heidi. I think every member of the president's foreign policy team should be called before the United States Senate as soon as possible and testify on exactly what happened in Helsinki and the Helsinki debacle. But one thing the Washington Post does report is that the foreign policy team gave Donald Trump a script to go by, believed that he was going to talk tough to Vladimir Putin, and then were shocked as they watched from the sidelines as the president just cowered and completely withered in front of the Russian leader.
Well, that's the thing about it. We can call them before Congress. I guess the question is, do they even know what happened in those 2 hours in that room? It was just the two men. They may have had a plan. We don't know if Donald Trump executed the plan. It certainly didn't look like it as we came out. We've got to go to break. We've got 1,000 people who want to jump in. We've got a lot more to say. As we go to break, I just want to read one quote from the president yesterday at that news conference that distills this whole thing. Quote, "I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today." Think about that as we head to break this morning. On Morning Joe, we'll talk to the two U.S. reporters who held the president's feet to the fire yesterday. The AP's Jonathan Lemire and Reuters' Jeff Mason. Both will be with us in just a moment. Also, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, former CIA director and now NBC analyst John Brennan, and the top Democrat on the House Intel Committee, Congressman Adam Schiff. We are just getting started on a very busy Tuesday morning. You're watching Morning Joe. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.